Hello learners, in this session we shall be talking about social and civil society movements in India in the post-independence period. I'm Professor Shubhangi Vaidya from the School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies. Let's begin by talking about the term social justice. Social justice, according to the Collins English Dictionary, refers to the principle that all members of society have equal rights and opportunities. And we see that the recent movements for social justice all over the globe strive to break down the social and economic barriers that prevent communities from availing of social goods and to provide social security nets and economic justice. Environmental movements in India also have a very strong element of social justice in them. The history of India's environmental justice movements can be traced back to the colonial period, in which grassroots resistance against the British was seen. For instance, in the Bengal Peasant Revolt of 1859 to 1863 against indigo plantations. The freedom struggle led by Gandhiji also expressed strong concerns for the local ecosystems and village self-sufficiency. Indeed, Gandhi's notion of Gram Swaraj, which was based upon self-sufficiency and village economy, was strongly opposed to large-scale industrialization. Gandhi strongly opposed the colonial policy of extraction of resources from the colonized nations and was very clear that the destruction of India's rural economy and the destruction of livelihoods in India was on account of the colonial policies of the British. And he did not want India to embark upon the same kind of policy of large-scale industrialization and destruction of local livelihoods. However, in the post-independence period, we see that India opted for large-scale industrial growth. Large infrastructure projects like dams, steel plants, etc. became the symbols of nation building and economic development. Now, while these projects were basically aimed to pull India out of its endemic poverty, we also find that on the flip side, this led to a displacement of local communities, destruction of habitats and livelihoods, and resulted in a number of environmental justice movements emerging on the ground in order to preserve the 3 J's, Jal, Jangal and Zameen, that is water, forests and land. Indigenous and marginalized communities have been displaced and deprived of resources that they have traditionally used for generations. And we see that the models of economic growth have not paid adequate heed to environmental conservation or sustainability. Indeed, we always see that there has been a debate between development on the one hand and environmental sustainability on the other hand. We also see, particularly in the contemporary times, the impact of human-induced climate change on poor and vulnerable groups, which is particularly severe. In fact, the poor pay the biggest price for unsustainable and exploitative development pathways adopted. Let's now talk in more detail about environmental and social justice movements. As we have indicated, the environmental movements embody the principles of social justice. The Earth Charter, launched in 2000, has social and economic justice as one of its pillars or main principles. And I'm quoting from there, it speaks about eradicating poverty as an ethical, social, and environmental imperative to ensure that economic activities and institutions at all levels promote human development in an equitable and sustainable manner, to affirm gender equality and equity as prerequisites to sustainable development, and ensure universal access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities, and also uphold the right of all without discrimination to a natural and social environment supportive of human dignity, bodily health, and spiritual well-being, with special attention to the rights of indigenous people and minorities." Unquote. I quote P.P. Karan, who wrote a very well-received paper on the Chipko Andolan. These environmental movements are an expression of the socio-ecological effects of narrowly conceived development based on short-term criteria of exploitation. The movements are revealing how the resource-intensive demands of development have built-in ecological destruction and economic deprivation. The members have activated micro-action plans to safeguard natural processes and to provide the macro concept for ecological development at the national and regional levels, unquote. So I think this quote really encapsulates some of the problems that we see with developmental projects and the way in which environmental and social justice movements all over the country have tried to present an alternative model and tried to really safeguard the interests of the local population and the local environment. The Chipko movement, which really has been one of India's most famous environmental movements, indeed, in fact, a globally renowned movement, which has inspired countless environmentalists all over the world. It was a non-violent movement to protect trees, which began in 1973 in the Chamoli district in present-day Uttarakhand. The immediate cause was the allotment of an entire ash tree forest to a private company, a sports good contractor, for commercial purposes. And Karan explains that the exploitation of the forest by outside entrepreneurs with government approval had for a very long time been a source of conflict between Uttarakhandi villagers and the state forest department. In fact, the British had instituted the tribal forest settlements in Kumaon in 1821. The villagers who traditionally depended upon forest produce were denied forest use. And the justification given for this was that indigenous agriculturalists and herders misused and overused the forest, causing deforestation. However, villagers did not cut down trees for fuel. Rather, they used only dead trees, fallen branches, and brush. Trees were felled only for material for the construction of houses. And large-scale profiteering was indulged by timber and charcoal contractors, but the local people were blamed for the deforestation. The conflicts between the local population and the contractors came to a flashpoint in 1972 near Gopeshwar in Chamoli district, when a local cooperative was denied permission to cut its small amount allotted of 12 ash trees for making implements. These trees were sold by the government to a sports good manufacturer to use to make cricket bats and tennis rackets. To prevent the trees from being cut, the villagers, and notably the women, clung to the trees, or chipko. Chipko means to stick to or to cling to, in an act of Gandhian non-violent resistance. Their action resulted in the permit to the manufacturer being cancelled, and thus the Chipko movement was born. It is estimated that between 1972 and 1979, more than 150 villages were involved with the Chipko movement, resulting in 12 major protests and many minor confrontations in Uttarakhand. In 1980, Sundarlal Bahuguna, a Gandhian environmentalist who played a leading role in the movement, appealed to the then Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, which resulted in a 15-year ban on commercial felling in the Uttarakhand Himalayas. Stalwarts and Gandhian activists like Sundarlal Bahuguna, Chandi Prasad Bhatt and Gaura Devi were the most prominent activists associated with the movement and gave a new direction to environmental activism all over the world. One of the most noteworthy aspects of the Chipko movement was the participation of women. Indeed, it is a fact that development, the negative aspects of development, most profoundly affect women and their livelihoods. In the Chipko movement, it was they who formed the front lines and whose moral authority and force was hard to resist. If we think back, what immense courage it required to resist the authorities, to cling on to the trees and refuse to let go, even though they were under so much physical threat. Women referred to the forest as their maika or their maternal home and used non-violent means to protect the forests, their livelihoods, and the ecosystem. Many ecofeminists, including Vandana Shiva, have remarked on the remarkable participation of women in the Chipko Andolan and the way in which their local understandings of the way forests and the ecosystem should be conserved have such a profound impact and such profound meaning in the contemporary discourse on environmental activism and environmental conservation. The Chipko movement also sparked activism in other aspects, including anti-alcohol movements, which was a response to the ill effects of alcohol addiction in rural areas. We find that addiction to alcohol was actually responsible for ruining families, and women took a very, very important part in ensuring that their menfolk gave up this bad habit so that the welfare of the family could be conserved. Let's now talk about the Apiko movement. The Apiko movement is, in a sense, the southern or South Indian version of the Chipko Andolan. Villagers of the Uttara Kannada district of Karnataka launched a similar movement to save their forests. In September 1983, men, women and children of Salkani hugged the trees in the Kalase forest. The Uttara Kannada forest cover had been severely depleted over the years, and the process of development, which included pulp and paper mill, plywood factories and several hydroelectric dams, had overexploited the forest resources. Apiko movement was locally known as Apiko Chaluvali. The locals embraced the trees which were to be cut by contractors of the forest department. The Apiko movement used various techniques to raise awareness, such as foot marches in the interior forest, slideshows, folk dances, street plays, etc. The movement also promoted afforestation on denuded lands and later focused on the rational use of the ecosphere through introducing alternative energy resource to reduce pressure on the forest. To quote Pandurang Hegde, one of the founders of the Apiko movement, in a nutshell, the three major P's, paper, plywood and power, which were intended for the development of the people, have resulted in a fourth P, poverty. The protest within the forest, when the Apiko movement started, continued for 38 days, and finally felling orders were withdrawn. The success of this agitation spread to other places, and the movement spread in 8 areas, covering the entire Sirsi forest division in Uttara Kannada and Shimoga districts of Karnataka. Another very, very important path-breaking movement which has gained international traction is the Narmada Bachao Andolan. It is one of the most powerful mass movements of recent years, which started in 1985 against the construction of a massive dam on the Narmada River. The Narmada is India's largest west-flowing river and supports a number of people with unique cultural and traditional resources, ranging from indigenous or tribal people who live in the jungles here to a large number of village folks. The Sardar Sarovar Dam and the Narmada Sagar were likely to displace more than 250,000 people. The NBA, or the Narmada Bachao Andolan, under the leadership of Medha Patkar, sought help for those rendered homeless and without livelihoods because of the construction of the Sardar Sarovar and other large dams along the Narmada. One of the important milestones in this movement was in 1990 when Medha Patkar led NBA members and some 3,000 people displaced by dam projects on a march from northern Madhya Pradesh towards the Sardar Sarovar Dam site. But they were stopped at the Gujarat border by police and pro-dam activists. The Sardar Sarovar Dam construction began again in 1999 after the construction was allowed by the court and was declared finished in 2006. It was inaugurated in 2017 by the Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Medha Patkar continues to fight for proper rehabilitation of the displaced people in Madhya Pradesh as well as the reception of the promised compensation by the Narmada Tribunal. The important aspect of this movement is that it has brought to the fore the different notions of development, the different contested notions of development. The Indian government has often argued that the benefits derived from the Narmada project outweigh the cost of displacement and therefore justify its construction. On the other hand, the NBA has argued that no matter how large the perceived benefits, the cost to the society at large cannot be compensated. And once again, we confront this fundamental question: can economic development be at the cost of environmental conservation or at the cost of the environment and livelihoods of the local people? Briefly, let's mention some of the other very, very important environmental movements in contemporary India. The Tehri Dam agitation, which was spearheaded by Sundarlal Bahuguna, in which he undertook long fasts and undertook Gandhian methods to protest against the raising of the Tehri Dam height. We also have the Chilka Bachao movement in Odisha, launched by the poor fisher folk, which prevented the entry of big business houses into the commercial aquaculture of prawns, which would have thereby threatened the livelihood of the poor. The Silent Valley movement, which was spearheaded by the Save Silent Valley Committee, which emerged to spearhead the protest against the construction of the dam across the Kunti River in the Silent Valley, Kerala. These are just some of the important environmental movements, and we find that as the process of development and as the process of economic growth continues, there is always a tension between what is happening on the ground, between local communities who want to also protect and preserve their livelihoods, and the larger notion of development, whose definitions, in a sense, seek to impose a pattern of growth and impose a pattern of development upon local populations. To conclude, we can say that environmental activism in contemporary India is closely associated with social justice objectives, taking on board the needs and the requirements of the most marginalized sections of the society. Definitions of development which do not include the local people and threaten their livelihoods and cultures must be questioned. And the debate between environment and development, to which we have referred to several times in the course of this lecture, really cannot be said to be sustainable anymore in an era of such acute environmental degradation and climate change. So the future directions for development and the future directions for environment and social justice need to be carefully thought of, need to be carefully discussed, and we need to ensure a path of development in which there will no longer be a clash between the larger imperatives of growth and the local imperatives of people leading their livelihoods in a sustainable manner. Thank you.